Oh, so sorry. Hey guys, how are you? Today I'm going to do a kind of little tour today in a little area of Manhattan. We're going to be in downtown, but we're going to be talking about something specifically. We're going to be talking about gentrification with the G word, but I'm going to be doing it with this woman named Sharon Zukin, Professor Sharon Zukin at CUNY, who's an expert on the subject. She wrote this book, which you caught me reading. Before we start, guys, check out the Patreon, huge help. Also, like and subscribe. You know, that's, what else is there to talk about? Other than that, Pat, my friend Pat, how are you? Helping me out today.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you for being here. Gonna be a nice day, so I don't know, instead of just rambling on, why don't we just get this started, huh?
All right.
All right. Okay, so I'm here with current professor, forever professor. Forever professor, author. She wrote a bunch of great books. One of the best I thought was Naked City. I don't want to speak for your opinion of your books, but she's talented, knows everything about this topic. So let's just dive in. How are you?
I'm talented and really feeling great.
You're talented. Yeah, you know what? Why wouldn't you feel great if you're so talented? So I thought we'd start here in Astor Place, kind of like the dividing line between Greenwich Village and the East Village, to kind of kick off this discussion. First of all, let's start out with the term gentrification itself. The term kind of is almost, I hate to say it, a little outdated in a way, in that it kind of refers to this kind of specific process when in reality this is kind of a bigger issue at this point. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's been a gradual process and a process that has gone through different stages. Now, back in the 1960s, there were middle-class people who were highly educated, like school teachers, professors, social service workers, journalists, who did not have a lot of money, but they wanted to live in the city, they had jobs in the city, and they had an appreciation of older, more diverse neighborhoods, and they liked the architecture, and they could afford to buy an apartment or buy a house because those areas had become run down, disinvested from. A house in Park Slope, say, in the 1960s, somebody like that could buy for $20,000, $50,000, and now it might be worth $5 million. And in many cases, they used their cultural capital, their education, their knowledge of history, to transform the area into a historic object of admiration.
A destination.
A destination. It became a destination, and over time, their cultural capital became financial capital. Right. And this happened to a huge degree in a somewhat different way, where the artists settled. First in SoHo, in Lower Manhattan, and eventually in Williamsburg. So that was the first stage of gentrification. And then as city governments, and the New York City government for sure, became more aware of the value of middle class people moving into these working class areas and fixing up houses, then the government became involved. And in many cases, the policing was beefed up when gentrifiers moved into an area. And this benefited longtime residents too, as long as they were not the ones that the police were going after. And the city government began in a bigger way than it had been doing to subsidize housing development. Housing development first of market rate apartments, which led to more gentrification because they were not built to be rented or sold to people with relatively low incomes.
With the intent of doing the same thing that initially happened with the gentrifiers buying.
Right.
They were like, let's get more of these people into these neighborhoods.
Right.
So let's just build housing for them.
Even though people still called that gentrification, the government became more involved in this. And it was happening on a much larger scale. So gentrification morphed into this funny kind of global reinvestment mania. And in the Bloomberg administration, there was a lot of rezoning to favor high-rise residential development, high-rise, high-density development on the big streets, the avenues as we call them in New York City, big streets, but to downzone or maintain the down zoning for low-rise houses on the side streets. And this, of course, wound up financially benefiting the house owners and also benefiting real estate developers who were building high-rise buildings. So during the Bloomberg administration, which took up the early 2000s, the city government created a voluntary program where real estate developers could opt to reserve, say, 20% to 30%, more like 20% in reality, of the new apartments for people at set income levels who would be paying so-called affordable rates. The de Blasio administration, by 2015, made this a mandatory program called mandatory inclusionary housing, where 20 to 30%, a negotiable percentage of new apartments, had to be rented or in some cases sold as condos at affordable levels. Yeah, the affordability levels are set by the federal government, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And those formulas, for reasons that I do not know, include all of New York City and some suburbs where wages are generally higher, so that the affordable levels are pegged to a higher level. So that if you're talking about the rezoning of East New York, for example, where incomes are generally low, you've got a problem that has to be resolved of what is affordable to people living in that neighborhood. By the same token, developers are not going to build, even in East New York, they are not going to build for the existing population because the existing population cannot pay the rents that the developers say they need.
You brought something up that I think is an interesting thing to talk about at this point. You talk about the existing populations in a neighborhood. And this brings up an interesting concept, and you talk about this in your book, and that is authenticity. The authenticity of a neighborhood. I think that means a lot to a lot of different people, but I think it does factor into this conversation about people moving into a neighborhood, what draws people to a neighborhood, how you put your finger on that, how you define that, how do you monetize that. So I was wondering if you would talk about that.
If you say something is authentic,
right,
it can mean that it is just the essence of itself. But who determines the essence? And is there one single essence? Now, gentrifiers are often attracted to the authenticity of ancient history. Like, who was in this neighborhood in the 1800s, right? Who was in this neighborhood now when gentrifiers move into a neighborhood might be a very different picture. So here you've got an existing population that could be a low-income population, a community of color, of various colors, different national backgrounds, and you've got gentrifiers drawn to some vision of cultural authenticity that might tie in with the architecture, but not with the existing population.
Or even the culture. So, I mean, you're talking about the 1800s, but even more recent history, the East Village being a good example, you have the punk scene, you have all these things going on in the 70s and 80s, and yet you detach that reputation from the people who live here now, and you move into this neighborhood where CBGB was, where there are a few businesses that are still around, but it's detached from the people who live here.
And detached from the rents that CBGB was paying.
Exactly. But what you talk about in your book that I thought was interesting is that this idea of authenticity, the definition of it, speaks to who has power in a city.
That's exactly right. And it could be, on the micro scale of a neighborhood, it could be the gentrifiers who have cultural capital, who have financial capital, who begin to have social capital if they create or take over community organizations, versus the longtime residents who have much less financial capital, less cultural capital in the sense of a formal college education, perhaps, and social capital that isn't measured. It's felt in terms of relationships on the street, but not registered in a formal sense of organizations.
And I think that's I guess what's interesting is that idea of authenticity. It speaks to the power because, okay, this is authentic because of A, history, B, history, whatever, but then the new people come in and they tweak that.
That's right.
And going forward, the new definition of authenticity is something else. It is Flophouse coffee, it is whatever, and then the next people come in. And their definition is, no, we're gonna build a huge high rise and we'll have a picture of Flophouse coffee, but that thing's going, and then it just keeps replacing.
You know, you mentioned the businesses. The businesses are and have been the victim of higher and higher rents. If it's a small business, they can't, balance the losses in that place against the profits in another store the way a chain can do.
You brought up the chain stores. This is an interesting thing. I think
Well, this is a great intersection.
Yeah,
to
there's
talk
a
about
lot.
chain
You're
stores.
right behind us. You got Wegmans, you got Starbucks, but I think what people forget with these chain stores is that they are the rents go up and they can actually survive. So you like to think, okay, it's a free market. Well, open your store and run them out of business then. Well, if a rent goes up so high, there is no small business that could exist there, because it doesn't matter how many empanadas you sell, you're never going to be able to afford, a $20,000 rent at a spot, but they can eat it. And just for the purposes of expanding their brand and getting it more out there and all that, and running out the competition.
Absolutely.
So I guess, speaking of that idea, what's the big problem with that? I mean,
Well, a lot of people who
for
shop
sure.
at Wegmans or have accounts at Chase Bank,
Sure.
which is on our other side
Or
here,
Starbucks, they
or
get their
go to
their
coffee at
battery
Starbucks.
acid here at Starbucks.
There are some advantages. There are some advantages in terms of price to having a supermarket instead of a bodega, a mom and pop. So there are, some advantages.
That's assuming it would remain static, though, because then
Right.
if that supermarket runs the others out of business, they have more incentive to raise their prices.
That's
there
a
is no more
possibility.
competition,
Yeah, that is,
and they have more, I guess, resources to do just that.
They
Exactly.
do. And look at the buildings, though. The new buildings around here and the new buildings everywhere always create large ground floor spaces for chains and for banks. They are so eager to
Right.
have chains and banks rent those spaces because they will sign long-term leases. They will pay higher rents. Banks, I think, pay the highest rents of any commercial ground floor tenant. And they will most probably be around for a long time.
Right.
Here we are at Astor Place, near the famous Astor Cube, which famously is perched on one point,
Mm-hmm.
and it spins.
It spins.
If you move it, it spins. If you push it, it spins. So that one point kind of represents the very
Delicate balance. Yeah, there you go.
of neighborhoods.
That's art.
Right?
Yeah, I will
It's a-
say though too, it's important to just remember, I guess, that all this is geared in policy. So you talk about like chain store. I think this might be an interesting point to bring up, that there are certain bills that are introduced to protect small businesses that are meant
yes.
for the smaller mom and pops and things like that. Where guess who's going to fight those? The people who don't need them. The bigger chains, all that. They're going to be like, no, just go ahead and get rid of these small.
No,
businesses, right?
absolutely.
So
the
this is
bigger
another thing.
businesses
It's not
and
really
real
a free
estate,
market.
The real estate
in
industry.
that way.
There has been a bill called the Small Business
Job Survival Act.
Act.
Yeah.
And
Been on the shelf for like 14, 15, 16 years.
maybe
something like
longer than
Yeah.
that. I mean, recently it seemed to have a majority of city
Yeah.
council members for it, and then it never came up
Yeah.
for a vote.
And what's important is people don't know it exists, one.
That's right.
And two, it's being fought against by very concerted efforts on the real estate side and on the big business side, pretty much. Yeah, I guess it's probably victim of its own prosperity. I think that's kind of what's happening.
In a way,
Look,
that's what
yeah.
gentrification,
That's what gentrification is. Yeah.
The neighborhood is a victim of its own
Yeah.
success.
And that's what the city of New York is kind of becoming as well. I mean, New York's the most expensive city in the world. It just got named that. So it's kind of, I guess just keeps snowballing. Well, anyways, I think we can start here. We talked about all the, the different chains and everything. Well, I guess we can move on to the next spot and talk about a tool that you can use to do this.
Okay.
What do you think?
Okay.
That wasn't very eloquent, but let's keep moving. Okay, Sharon, so now we're in Union Square. We're here to talk about another, I guess, interesting device used by the city to take care of neighborhoods, specifically the landowners and everything, and that is BIDs. Business Improvement Districts, everybody. This is one of the first ones, correct? Union
The
Square?
first one
first,
in New
yeah.
York City.
And so a bid, basically, this group of the landowners in the area who assess a tax in a way, and they use that money to then provide security, clean the area, but also they're interested in, obviously, raising property value. So you can imagine this has a certain effect on the landscape, on what they control, what they keep out, what they keep in, and they are not answerable in the end directly to the taxpayer. They're not answerable to the voter because they are private. So let's talk about that. Let's get into it, huh?
Okay, so here we have the Union Square Partnership,
Yep.
which began to manage this park in the mid-1980s when it was recognized by many people, the police, some residents, workers in the area, as being a problematic place. There were drug dealers in the park, but the city did not have enough money to clean up the park in any sense. So that was still the time of the fiscal crisis,
right. 70s and 80s.
1975, 1976, and that was introduced.
Hear that
the
siren?
park is not divorced from the city.
Yeah, as you can hear the siren. They're coming for us. I think we're shooting without a permit, so they're on their way here.
So, a few big business owners and universities around here in the early 1980s took a model from a plan that was in one of the Canadian cities. It was a model of public-private partnership where the private sector partners anteed up a lot of the money to pay for improvements in the area where they were located. One of the problems was, though, in this space, which stands at the borders of several different community board districts, the problem was who has control or who could take control of this space. Really, nobody had the money to do it. The city didn't have the money to do it. The business owners were not used to taking charge of public space except for sweeping the sidewalk in front of their building. The business owners around here, the big business owners around here, and the universities got together with the companies that managed or owned buildings in the area, a lot of buildings in the area, and they said, we're going to form a non-profit business organization. According to the U.S. tax code, that's a 501c6, not a 501c3, which is what we used to call a charity, a non-profit to help some cause. And the way they financed themselves was very innovative. The organizations and businesses that pay property taxes to the city taxed themselves. They agreed to tax themselves an additional 1%. That would then be returned to this public-private organization to be called the Union Square Partnership, and that 1% would be used to keep the public space of the park and the surrounding streets clean, safe, and
I like how you paused after saying safe and looked around. You're like, I think it's important too to point out at this point that now there's dozens of these types of groups all around the city.
More than dozens. Yeah. There must be. There are at least as many, like around 60, as there are community board districts in the city.
Yeah, there's 59.
And okay, so there are about 60, right? Yeah. And this public-private partnership has not only become the preferred way of managing and helping to fund park space, public park space, but it also has become a preferred model for dealing with everything.
Right. And this is also an innovation that New York did that now is being copied around the country.
Around the world.
Yeah.
I was in a number of years ago. Yeah. I was in Cape Town, South Africa, and saw signs on the street, about a business improvement district. And it began right here. Union Square.
Look at that.
In 1984.
Right here, right under the horse's ass, right above our heads.
Have you noticed that that horse statue is anatomically correct? It's hard, nothing to the imagination.
It's hard not to notice.
If you stand underneath it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you got to be precise as an artist, I guess. Yeah. He really had to do his research on that one. Okay, so we relocated another spot here.
And in fact, we should point out that
the tables and chairs.
This movable furniture was another innovation of the 1980s, where public space was redesigned to make it seem more civilized.
That's right.
And people at the time said, you can't put movable furniture in a public park. It'll be stolen.
But they lock it up. They lock it up
at night, but I haven't seen anybody walking down the street with these chairs.
That's true. Well, it's interesting because the people who lock it up are the ones that are paid by the Union Square group and all that. So they're walking around locking stuff up. So the 80s is when they introduced the chairs. The 80s was the time of, banking and deregulation and movable furniture. Those are the two things Reagan So
Yeah.
they're the group here that oversees it. It's nice, it's clean, it's safe, secure. Sounds all pretty great. What's the other
But-
side of this? Yeah, the but. What's the but? Huh?
Well, the but is that it's the private sector that's running the show.
Yes. So they're not accountable to the voter. They're not accountable to the taxpayer, and they get a final say if they're in charge of security. They can kind of say if a protest isn't exactly jiving with what they want. Well, first of all, their whole goal is to increase property value, correct? I mean, one of them.
That is very important to
Yeah.
say, to emphasize that it's the building owners and the business owners
Right.
who are represented by the bid. And they want to stabilize the area in the sense of public behavior, but they also want to stabilize and even raise property values.
Mhm. So, and that's very important because that's gonna basically create a certain type of policy, create and exclude certain types of people who don't positively influence that, right?
Where does surveillance merge into control of other people's behavior? I mean, they have to call the police in if they decide someone should be arrested, or with homeless people, because there are a lot of homeless people around this area. It's uncertain whether and how they can intervene in a situation.
And how do you think this is going to change things going forward? I guess if it all continues to go in this direction, do you think in the future more things will be delegated to the private sector until
They are delegated to the
And so what
private
does that
sector
mean?
every
What does that
day,
mean
yeah.
for us as taxpayers, as voters? What are the effects of that? What is the possible
That
consequence?
is true. That is true in every sphere
Sure.
now. I mean, museums, libraries.
Tax subsidies to the developers, all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, and then then there are always negotiations about trying to get the developers to kick back some benefits.
Right,
They call
plazas
it
and-
capturing value. Yeah, it could, in one decade it was plazas.
Yeah.
In another decade it was build new entrances to the subway. I mean, this is going on as we speak.
Yeah.
It's new entrances to the subway. There are attempts, ongoing attempts to capture value from real estate development, but that's always a matter of negotiation. It's never taken for granted.
Do you think there is any going back? Do you think this is just the new way of doing things? Do you think there is going to be a shift back to the public sector?
I'd like to see a shift back to the public sector, at least in a moral sense.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think a big part of it is people knowing that this is happening. They don't even realize it. They just think, oh, we're at Union Square Park, the city, et cetera. They don't know that this is actually what's happening.
Well, awareness does not necessarily lead to demands for change.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Certainly not change back. And in terms of the improvements to public space, you cannot argue with the fact that more people are using these public spaces. They are more public in terms of use, although not more public in terms of control.
It is a trade-off. I guess it's a balance. I think what's important to strike that balance is information. I think the more people know how things are being done and what is the process that's being used, the more they can kind of chime in, the more they can make decisions.
And there should be seats for the public in all of these public-private partnerships.
Good luck with that. That's going to be a tough one to sell to the people around here. I mean, Lord knows the community boards already have, have their hands tied. That's already an innovation, having the community board, but their power is so limited by the people who have the... Anyways, all right. Well...
But that's a good mechanism.
It is a good, I agree. But all the cops are running around here. We're talking about how safe it is, and all we hear is sirens, so that's probably not a good sign.
Oh, look on the bright side, it could be an ambulance bringing sick people to the hospital.
That's true. More sick people, less crimes. That's my slogan. All right, so now we're here in SoHo, which is a very fancy neighborhood. We can go to Louis Vuitton after this interview, but I came here because this was recently the subject to a recent rezoning in 2021, I believe. But rezoning is basically a tool that kind of can shift a neighborhood around, the makeup of a neighborhood, very quickly. And even though it is just a land use urban planning thing, it has been been used recently. We talked about Bloomberg and other mayors as well, as a way to kind of revamp a neighborhood. I don't know if you could talk to this a little bit, since we're standing here on the sidewalk. Let's jump in, huh?
The greatest place to talk about zoning,
That's
because
right.
we could be on one side of the street in SoHo and on the other side of the street in a completely different zone.
That's right.
zoning laws are about two things. Use, what kind of use you can make of the buildings, and size, how big, how fat, how dense buildings can
How
be.
overweight, please. It's 2024.
Okay, well,
Yeah. You want to fat shame buildings.
These are the two things that zoning laws address. They do not address directly who can live in a building or who can live in a neighborhood or the rents. They can't address this. They can only say this neighborhood, like SoHo before a rezoning in 1971, SoHo was only a manufacturing district and nobody could live in SoHo. No residential use was legalized in SoHo before 1971. So nobody was investing much in SoHo because you had the Great Depression in the 1930s, and then you had World War II, and then you had, after the war, a movement by factories to the suburbs where they had more space, and then by the 1970s, of course, you had outsourcing and movements of factory production outside the United States completely and overseas.
And taking their place, you had the artists coming in.
Well, wait a second, that's what I'm getting to.
Oh,
So from the 1950s on, the artists began to move in and move into bits and pieces of downtown Manhattan, from the East River waterfront to the West River waterfront. By the late 1960s, they began to concentrate in SoHo, and building owners did not invest a penny into very decrepit buildings by that point. But for artists, these buildings offered large spaces at cheap rents, and a lot of them had really big windows. So artists began to move in even though it was not legal for them to live here. Through their great efforts, in 1971, residential use was legalized in SoHo, but only for artists, who at that point had to be certified by the city government as real artists, professional artists, to live in SoHo. Over the years, that part of the law fell away. The city did not enforce it any longer, but eventually non-artists moved in also. And by the 1980s or so, more stores began to open up. It was illegal for stores to be on the ground floor, even though there were more of them. For each store lease that was signed, an exception or a variance to the zoning law had to be applied for and voted for and negotiated and so on. By the 2010s, the city planning department said this zoning is just too old, it has to be modernized. We should be able to legalize residential use for anyone, and we should be able to have stores opening up without going through all of this convoluted procedure. And the city government was well aware that real estate prices had risen over the years, and there were a lot of non-artists who were living in SoHo lofts that were now worth a great deal of money. You know, in 1971, an artist might have bought a 2,000 or 3,000 square foot loft for $10,000, but now that loft was worth $1 million
Well,
or
funny
$2
you mention that.
million.
I'm sure, you know, Adam Levine, the guy from Maroon 5, I'm sure you're a huge Maroon 5 fan. He just sold his loft. It was like 2,100 square feet for $5.4 million. 2,100 square feet for $5.4 million. That's kind of crazy. What significance does rezoning play in changing the neighborhood or capitalizing on it?
Well, the planners, city planners say that zoning does not change a neighborhood. It doesn't create the change, but it does create the conditions for change. They are only responsible for zoning changes.
Which also plays into density. So for example, you go to like Williamsburg is a good example of this. I'll cover it in another video, but I talked about it before. They go to high density residential all along the waterfront, and you have these massive condos being built in what used to be an industrial neighborhood, and it immediately taxes the infrastructure, the subway, everything is completely, you know, pushed to the limit.
But in our city, we don't have any concern with that, right?
Push that to the future.
I mean, you can try, the city, one of the city government agencies can try to negotiate with real estate developers who present projects for new construction to try to improve infrastructure, to include a
Right.
space for a public school, for example, to build a public park or contribute to a public park. A city government can try to capture the value that a real estate developer
Right.
creates, but it's the real estate developer who will capture most of
Exactly.
the financial value. That's how it is. Over the decades, because rents are under the jurisdiction of New York State, not New York City, and the New York State legislature is more conservative
Right,
and
sure.
generally does not want controls or regulation of rents. The city has lost over time thousands of rent-controlled and rent-stabilized apartments. This is a constant bone of contention, so that the state legislature in some way would have to be persuaded to do the opposite of what they've been doing for
Right.
years. That is to expand rent regulation rather than curtail it.
Right. Yeah. Which I guess that's kind of probably the moral of all this story, is that it's all the laws. And I think what people don't realize is that the state is actually in charge of most of this stuff. And it obviously is going to be less responsive than the city because they're not here, and they're also beholden to so many other interests outside of cities like New York. So one, you have to appeal to the laws, and two, we got to get more of that power in the cities as well, which is probably harder than it sounds.
That's true, but let me raise a last point
One
about
last point,
SoHo.
let's hear it.
SoHo buildings are restricted
Uh-huh.
in terms of change by multiple historic district and historic building designations. That means you cannot change the exterior of a building, and you cannot demolish a historic building. So the amount of space that could possibly be habitable in SoHo is limited by this. Do we value as a city, as people living in a city, do we value the feeling that you get from walking around a space like this? Or do we say, forget it, we need housing, let's tear all this stuff down? We can never rebuild that.
Right.
We can never recapture the memory, even if you have that rampant commercialism on the ground floor, even if you have artists living on the upper floors. Is it worth it to us as a city to keep the feeling of some spaces as historic, as the brick and mortar memory of what this city has been before?
Yeah, I guess that's the balance to strike. The important thing, once again, though, is that this is something that's done at the city level. It's not just stores moving into a neighborhood. It's not just yuppies moving into a neighborhood.
That's right.
It's something that we are all kind of responsible for, whether
We are.
with who we vote for, what we do, what kind of petitions we sign, or whatever.
That's true.
All right, let's go to City Hall. Well, look at that, guys. Back to my rock. I'll be here for the rest of my life. But that was a great little chat, little walk around the city. Pat, what'd you think? Did you learn something?
Yeah, I learned a lot.
I believe you. For once in my life, I believe you. Guys, that was pretty much it. If you liked it, go ahead and, like and subscribe, do that whole thing. And also, please check out the Patreon. That's a huge help. That's how I fund these things. That's how I buy the hard copy books that I like to read on rocks in the park. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna get out of here and go eat a croissant. We learned a lot about gentrification, didn't we? Pretty cool. Yeah.